let me take the first shot. Thank you very much, both of you, for wonderful presentations, both the global mosaic of elasticity and kind of the firm, grounded central Indiana approach. My question is really a broader one about when donor interests overlap with the interests of corporations and local governments. What is kind of the approach of community foundations to that, and how is that interface evolving, and how is it likely to evolve kind of when governments and corporations have an overlap with your donor interest? How do you interact with that?
This is an area that we're very interested in. I actually think that the number one relationship that's the most important to me as the CEO of both the Indianapolis Foundation and CICF is the mayor of Indianapolis. My number one job is to become a great partner for the mayor of Indianapolis, whoever it is. Doesn't matter if it's Republican, Democrat. That is where we can get then have the greatest impact. Because if we're trying to do great works in the community, the Cultural Trail is an example. If we don't have a relationship with the mayor of Indianapolis, the Cultural Trail is never going to go anywhere, a project like that. So we're always looking for that intersection of, there's a project, here's the way we think of it, actually, is that there's probably 100 projects that are on a list right now for the city of Indianapolis to do that we care about. And then we decide through our donors, through what corporations, we kind of look for the leverage and what's part of our vision. And let's say that there's something that we think is a top priority and it's on that 100 list. If we can marshal some philanthropic resources, if we put in $250,000 or $100,000 or $200,000, get our friends at Eli Lilly and Company to put in $100,000 and find someone like the Ephraimson family or the Glick family to put in another $100,000. I can then go to the city and say, you know, you guys have this thing on your list. I know you want to do it. We're willing to put $500,000 in the pot. Do you think we can get this done? Do you think we can make this a priority? And the answer is likely yes. So we're looking for those opportunities all the time.
So a couple of things. The first thing I would say is that we have a dynamic relationship with government, local government. So between San Francisco and if you go past, if you know the area, Mountain View, where Google is and where our headquarters are, to San Jose, out to Gilroy, which is the Garlic capital of America, over to the coast, Half Moon Bay and Pacifica. We have some 60 municipalities. Within San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, there are 54 different school districts, just in Silicon Valley proper. And so it's a dynamic relationship. Sometimes we partner with government. Sometimes we're in the position of challenging government. Sometimes we are partnering with corporations. Sometimes we're challenging corporations. And so it's a dynamic relationship. So on the one hand, we have huge partnerships on early learning with San Mateo County Schools and with the county government. We just got a $16.5 million grant from the federal government in support of that effort from the Social Innovation Fund. Huge, important local effort. And at the same time, in our two counties, we found that kids who are African American and Latino in 8th grade are systematically being held back and forced to repeat algebra in 9th grade when they have passed the test, the standardized test and the grade course test. And what that does is that throws them off track in high school for getting enough math requirements to go to college. It's unconscionable. And so we have introduced state legislation to require them to do what we all think they ought to do, is place kids based on their test scores into the courses that they have earned the right to be in. We are both antagonistic in that way with the local boards of education, and yet we partner with the local boards of education. And we have that duality of working where we can and also champion and lifting up issues of concern where we think we must for the broader community good. I also want to emphasize and make clear our emphasis on doing things national and global doesn't take away our local. We have to get out of this notion of it's either that or it's this. It's either one or it's other. Or when I meet with a donor, the donor's only interested in this or only interested in that. I'll talk just briefly about one of our most popular donors with information that's in the public sphere. Our first interaction with Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan was $100 million to do work in Newark, New Jersey. But they were donors in our community. And so we were faced with, we've got donors in our community who want to do work someplace else, and they think we're the ones to do that work. Do we do that work because it's not in our community? There's a huge debate. We ended up doing it, right? Because we did that work, they're now doing a $120 million gift with schools in our community. And yet, when the Ebola crisis hit, they said, we want to do $25 million because we believe that somebody ought to be doing something to help Ebola, and so we're partnering with the U.S. government to fight Ebola. They're the same people. The same people had an interest in New Jersey. They have an interest in Silicon Valley. They have an interest in health needs. They want an institution that can be full service. It's not that they're here or they're there or they're not there. They have a duality, and they see themselves as wanting to be flexible to those interests wherever they are. And I don't think they're dissimilar to what many of us are. I want Indiana University to be successful. I want Princeton to be successful, my alma mater. I want Morehouse College to be successful. My high school in Chicago, where I have a scholarship fund. I'm still the same person. But I have all these different interests, and I want an institution that can facilitate my doing that. So it's a both and, it's not an either or.
Just one quick comment about that. Just as he talked about how Silicon Valley is so many counties, 64 or whatever municipalities, that does really have a huge impact on how you work as a community foundation. And we see that just the difference in the fact that Indianapolis has Unigov is a different kind of way of working than what my colleague Terry Anker, as the president of the Legacy Fund of Hamilton County, who's a vice president of CICF, he has 8 towns and cities. I really have, one, and we kind of work with Lawrence and Speedway in a little bit different way, and not very fully because we just don't have that, it's not the focus. But, so your geography, how government is arranged, how it's organized, certainly has a huge impact on how we then respond to our own community. There was someone?
This question is for Emmett. I'm wondering, when you left Minnesota, I'm a Minnesotan, if your view on community changed when you were at the Minneapolis Foundation, being at a foundation that's been around for so long, and how their sense of community was versus Silicon Valley, and being a part of the creation of that, how your view of community changed and how you're able to affect others' views of community at the 2 different foundations.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Not nearly as much as you would think. So let me tell you a little bit about the Minnesota you think you know, and maybe a little bit about the Minnesota that others don't know. Yes, it has the Scandinavian, Norwegian influence, but today the Twin Cities is home to one of the largest populations of Tibetans, largest populations of Ethiopians in the United States, one of the largest Jewish populations. It is a very diverse Southeast Asian Hmong, highest population in the Twin Cities. It's not your grandfather's Minnesota anymore. And so those donors, as I was leaving, those people were coming to me and saying, we live in this community, but we have interests outside of this place. If I create a fund here, can I do something back at home? Can I also do, because they had a duality of interests that weren't just in Minnesota. I think community building principles are the same. I think the biggest shift to going to Silicon Valley was understanding a libertarian mindset. Right? And a libertarian mindset is very different. It's not Democratic, it's not Republican, it's not progressive, it's not conservative, it's a blend. And understanding that, and understanding the innovator's ethos, that if it's not broke, find a reason to break it, was different. But community building principles, I think, are largely the same. But I'm in a place that I want to leave you with the very best community foundations reflect the people in the community that they're serving. And I happen to be in a place where many of those people come from someplace else. They have multiple interests. They think in national and global terms. And it's not that they don't care about where they live. They care deeply. But they also have a lot of other interests. And so when they come in, they want an institution that can respond to the totality of their interests. Right? They want to be able to sit down and say, I want to do this here, I want to do that here at home, I want to do this over there, and yeah, by the way, we were interested in this other thing. And we're blessed that they have the resources to make huge gifts to do those things. So it's a net good for society, and it's a good for our local community. It's both and, it's not either or.
Thank you both so much for contributing good thoughts. One of the challenges we have in society today, whether it's local, national, or global, is that some of the issues transcend all geography. And I'll just pick one that's been on my mind a little bit, and that's the issue of human trafficking. But you could substitute any other cause that you're passionate about for this question. So how do we harness the energy, the vitality, the richness of the community foundations in the United States, all of which have a significant number of assets, but the last time I checked, the word bank was not in their name? How do we harness those programmatically, collectively, in advocacy to address some of these challenges that are tearing cities apart from the inside out?
So you know, there's a supposition that might have been in your question that I want to address first, which is donors have a multiplicity of interests. And while part of my job is to encourage them to the things I think are important, I get surprised all the time with the donors that I interact with who have ideas that end up being successful that I never thought could work, because they have a passion for it. So I don't, you know, it's collective when it's my idea sometimes. Right? Why doesn't everybody pick my idea? Because that's really important. And they care about seawater rise. Right? I've got donors. You're going to laugh. I'm going to put it this way. I've got donors who are working on saving the Earth from an asteroid attack. Now that may sound funny at first. Mary's laughing. But these are Nobel Prize winners and former astronauts who are raising money about that. And they would say to you, I'm not going to go way off topic here, but they would say to you tonight, on a clear night, when you can go look at the moon, see all those dings in the moon, that's every time an asteroid hit the moon. And then once you realize that, you realize it's not that funny anymore. That in fact it's a real possibility. And there are easy things we could do to avoid it. I never knew that before I started talking with those donors. Nobel Prize winners and astronauts sitting around the table explaining to me about the physics of it. And so I just want to caution us that our idea, but human trafficking, we just released a report 3 months ago on human trafficking in Silicon Valley. We're working with both counties to the question of work with government. Human trafficking always increases around Super Bowls, and we've got the next one in our area, so we're trying to do that. But the idea that every community foundation can pick a topic, we can't agree. We're cats, because the people we work with, you are cats, and you have your favorite idea. And we've yet, you know, we can get small consensus here and there, but the global, we're all going to be the same thing, really goes against the character of our individual communities and the challenges we face and how we go about it, such that your priority here with your history and your things are not going to be the priorities of the things we're worried about: skyrocketing affordable housing, transportation, gridlock. It's not about creating jobs and growth that I'm worried about. It's how to make sure that those jobs and growth get down to the people at the bottom who are being excluded. And that's the number one issue in my community. That's not the issue in Detroit. Really, that's all we're about, is jobs and growth. So the idea that I can go there and say, let's create this all for one is much harder in practice than you might imagine. We can't agree on the thing within our community because they're people with strong passions. That took too long.
No. I think that covers it well, but I'll give you an example. So at these larger community foundations, every once in a while, one of our colleagues will suggest, hey, I think we need to kind of strike out as a field, have a big national issue that we can all tackle together. It'll elevate the awareness of us, all of us nationally. And what do you think about this? And usually at this point, that's a colleague who is relatively new to the field. And because, again, as Emmett said, it's like pretty much every time someone's come up with an idea, it's not something that we're focused on or necessarily makes sense for Central Indiana. So I'm thinking, well, count me out. But if 4 or 5 of them want to get together and can find common ground, maybe they will. But I'm not going to opt in just to be a good colleague in the field because it's a disservice to my own donors. I'll give you another kind of illustrative of the challenge of philanthropy as a community foundation. So I ran the Indiana Repertory Theater for 7 years. That's what brought me here from California, and it was pretty simple. Everyone on the board agreed that the job was to create great professional theater that served the community in many ways. So if a board member said, hey, what do you think about doing a ballet? We'd all, it didn't happen because it's like we're about creating professional theater. So I get to the community foundation, and we have a retreat in my first 12 months on the job, and I ask the board members at a retreat, what is personally your number one cause? 17 board members at the retreat, 17 different answers. And I thought, oh my gosh, am I in trouble? How am I going to steer an organization with each member of the board thinks we should, focus on a completely different cause because they all had different number one causes. So we kind of had to work on that over, 4 or 5 years before we could even find, a way to go out and talk about, family success and in college readiness and success and inspiring places, which are 3 initiatives undergirding that talent attraction and development strategy. But that took us 4 or 5 years to get to that pretty broad area of focus. So it's a challenge.
So we've heard about the obligations that you have to your donors, obligations to your community, but how do you envision your obligation as one of the larger funders in your community to the local nonprofits? How do you ensure that they are able to operate without potentially falling into a trap of doing what are your objectives so that they can get the money and following their own missions?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we talk about that all the time, and so I'll give you a couple of answers on that. So we advise our donors over the last 5, 6, 7 years that they need to come from, they need to organize their philanthropy. We think it's more powerful, more rewarding for them if they'll organize their philanthropy out of what they deeply care about. Some know what they deeply care about, actually some don't, and we try to help them uncover that through a process. And in doing that, we get them to start, focusing, which we think will have better results for them and better results overall. But I think we've been talking about how we need to moderate that conversation a little bit because we think now, I think the better answer is a majority of or a certain amount of your philanthropy should be around those focus areas, but it would be good if you were still somewhat open to some other areas. And we've done that ourselves. So we have these 3 community leadership initiatives all around that big theme. We've decided that about 40% of the grant making that we control out of our own endowments that aren't our donor advised funds, that we're going to give 40% of that to those focus areas: college readiness and success, inspiring places, which is about quality of life, quality of place, and family success. But we're going to keep 60% of our grant making open to the good ideas of the not-for-profits. But I actually had a staff member, I think she ultimately left us because she thought, she was really terrific, very talented, very dedicated, but she thought that our number one job as a community foundation should be to make the not-for-profit organizations as good and successful as we could possibly make them. And when we started working on our own community leadership initiatives and narrowing our focus and weren't spending as much time as helping every grantee do the best proposal, figure out their world to the degree that we could help them, she thought we went way off the tracks, and we went in a different direction, and her values were one and my values were another. So it's not that one's right and one's wrong. We just made another choice.
So I want to pick up where Brian left off, which is to say, I always ask the question in the institutions I've led, who's the customer? The customer for me is not the nonprofit. The customer for me is the community. I choose nonprofits that can deliver the best product to community. If somebody can educate more kids and do it better, faster, cheaper, that's the partner I want to work with. That's my obligation. My obligation is not to every nonprofit. My obligation for community is to find, because I have limited resources. So my job is to pick the very best nonprofits that can deliver what we're trying to do. Second piece that's going to be very uncomfortable, but I've become comfortable with this reality, is that institutions of philanthropy have power. And we have power because we get to say yes and no. Just like your faculty member gets to say, you've demonstrated competency in what I've asked you to do, or you haven't. But we get to say yes and no. That's a powerful responsibility, but it's ours. It's not shared. We ought to do that thoughtfully. We ought to do that with respect. No one should ever feel demeaned in the process. But our job is to say yes and no in what nonprofit can get the job done. And sometimes those are very painful decisions. They're controversial decisions. But I don't start out saying, I say shame on a nonprofit that takes money from me because those were our priorities. There are a lot of opportunities to go get money within community. And so if it's your weakness of values, if you are shifting and playing a game to get money, it's not my weakness of values to say, this is what we're trying to achieve for the community. So I think I share Brian's views very strongly. We're trying to move community along a continuum because out of a thoughtful process, we've agreed these things are really important. And if you shift to fit into that, it's not my values that went off track or I somehow elbowed you or forced you into doing it. You didn't have the courage of your convictions to find other resources and other people to help you get that done. That's why there's a whole philanthropic ecosystem that is about not only institutional philanthropy, but the far bigger bucket, which is the individual philanthropy that each of us participate in.
Hi, Nick Dachikowski with the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. So I want to heat up the room just a little bit more. And tonight I picked up a couple more Emmett quotes. For those of you who don't know, they're there in the field, and it's wonderful. Dr. Carson is known as a provocateur. So a couple years ago at a community foundation conference in San Diego, you made a famous statement that for community foundations that our business model is broken. So I'm wondering, and since that time I believe the Silicon Valley Community Foundation has grown by a few billion. So I'm wondering, is that statement still true? Maybe a little explanation of what you meant by it for those who weren't there. And then for Brian, is your business model broken or not?
So it was in San Francisco where I made, so just to correct the record. And I do think the model is largely broken. And it's broken for a couple of reasons. The financial model of community foundations is essentially we have assets under management and donor funds. We charge a fee on those assets, and that fee enables us to have space, to have a staff, to have benefits, and that's the model. There's more competition, as I described in my remarks, than ever before. And more competition does what? It drives the price of the product down. And as the price of the product goes down, then you need to grow scale to make up the money. If you have a limited geography, it's very hard to get scale. Right? So if I have a community foundation that's only 2 blocks, I need to get every person in that 2-block area, and then every family's average wealth needs to be really high to sustain my community foundation. Right? You get the point, right? Its price is driven down because of commercial gift funds, Fidelity, Vanguard, and Schwab. People get to compete. They're Catholic community foundations, Jewish community foundations, university community foundations. Everybody's got a donor advised fund. So now people get to shop within an area. So that's driven prices down, and people are fee sensitive. Despite everything you may hear, there are people who are fee sensitive. You can do the greatest work in community, great. They don't want to pay you to do that work more than they could pay someplace else, right? For all of the Buy America, people go, how much is it? They're committed until you have to pay the extra dollar, right? I'm trying to be real here. So then the question becomes, how do you get scale? And so unless community foundations find scale or other revenue sources, right? What are other revenue sources? We do back office work for over 150 corporations, right? On their CSR work, and they pay us a fee for that. We do consulting work for private foundations that pay us a fee to help do their scope work. And so we've got multiple revenue streams as well as scale to provide a stable growth platform because it is a social enterprise. It's committed to social. It's an enterprise that has I've got to pay salaries for people who live in one of the most expensive places in the United States. And so I think for a lot of community foundations, because I get the call, they are struggling with the fact that the fees on assets no longer are covering the expenses. And they're trying to figure out either new revenue sources or how to go to scale. But they would agree, I think, largely that the financial model that existed for 100 years is not sustainable for the next 10. And I don't know what Brian thinks.
So I agree with that. I don't know what that number is for a community foundation to feel like they have enough scale to provide the kind of sophisticated services that donors today want. I would propose that scale number is at least 75 million, if, at the very minimum, maybe 100 million. We have a lot of community foundations in Indiana. We have 95 of them. I don't know the number, but I would say out of those 95, 85 of them are below $75 million in assets. So that's a challenge. When it comes to CICF, we were doing, we started this very expensive, takes a lot of time, a lot of employees, a lot of employee time to do these community leadership initiatives. It's all about creating partnerships. It's all about leveraging. It's all about getting people, influencing people. That's on the ground work. It's boots on the ground. And when we first started that in 2005, well, everything was great. The economy was great. We were getting new money in, new philanthropic money in, new money we could fee. Investments were growing our assets. That's more money we could fee. Everything is great, doing all this stuff. 2008 comes, we lose 30% of our assets, which meant we lost 30% of our operating revenue. At the time, that actually represented about $1.7 million. That wasn't there the following year. How do we continue to work on the cultural trail, reconnecting to our waterways? Our Family Success Initiative, Centers for Working Families. How do we do all that when we have to cut $1.7 million? So we went and really looked to see how broken our model was if we're going to do community leadership, which we were very dedicated to. So we went into a staff retreat, met with some of our really great, smart business leaders on our board and some of our donors who weren't on the board. And we came up with this idea that we needed angel investors, people who would support specifically the work we're doing in community leadership. And now we raise $700,000 to $750,000 a year. And what's really great about that is not only that does that money help pay the costs and it really represents a different change in business model. We're actually doing, in some ways, it's got its own kind of character, but we're doing annual fundraising. We never did that before. It's a change in business model. We've been able to sustain that now over a couple of years at that level. And the really wonderful thing is by doing that, we're accessing new partners in the community around community leadership and people, and some of those people are opening up donor advised funds, and we never would have had the conversation with them about donor advised funds if they weren't a $5,000 or $10,000 a year annual donor, because they thought that they had to have $100,000 or $1 million right up front to open up a donor advised fund, and they learned about us, and they learned how they could start a fund, you know, less than that and grow it over time. And then some of them actually have come in with $1 million donor advised fund because they're so excited about the partnership that they have with us on community leadership. So that's actually that business model keeps evolving and keeps getting more exciting for us. But we did change it, and we think we're healthy once again.
Good evening. Looking forward to tomorrow morning. First, I would like to thank you both for a very enlightening presentation. I think everybody will agree with me that it was wonderful. I like your definition, Dr. Carson, of the elasticity of the definition of community. And my question goes in that direction, in taking us global now. You know, you mentioned that in your conclusion that, you know, to remain relevant to the global society, every forward-thinking institution needs to embrace the global future. And that's very important. It's near to my heart. But I also realize when you mentioned that, well, your relationship with government, for example, has to be dynamic. You mentioned all those things. You sometimes partner with them, sometimes you have to challenge them. Now, in a global society, you know, the emerging economies in particular, talking about those with instability, politically speaking, how do you engage with those institutions? How do you work with them to implement, and what kind of accountability you get from them or from the organizations that are the beneficiary of your grant-making work? Thank you.
Thank you. So a really hard question. I know the hour's late. So there was once somebody who had something very complex to try to describe. And they said, well, give it to him simple. And he said, what's simple? Well, put it on a bumper sticker. And he said, okay, a bumper sticker, how many words do I have? They said 2 words. He thought about it for a minute. He said, well, accept complexity. And in some ways, that's my response. Working in India has a different set of cultural basis, charitable laws, do's and don'ts, legal structures that are very different than Kenya, which is very different than Brazil, right? And so Ukraine is right now under a State Department rule, so there are extra scrutiny for any grants going to the Ukraine. So it is complex. We have 4 attorneys on our staff who do this work. We have the protocols of the Pension Protection Act and other things and checklists. So this isn't something you just, oh, well, you want to go do the work. You have to invest in the capability to do the work at the highest standard of accountability. And having said that, then that creates a capability that attracts people who have that interest to say, boy, I can do that through you, and so it becomes a revenue model that helps sustain the local work that we're trying to do. But it's complicated, it's expensive, it's hard. You got to deal with cultural barriers, language barriers, a whole range of things, and each location is different, right? So you can't, it's not a straight line, but the more you do, the more volume you have. And we're pleased that we have we're in a place of a lot of volume. We learn more, right? So I'll leave with this. When you're picking a surgeon, you want to find a surgeon that's done it 1,000 times, not the surgeon who says, you're my 10th. Now, we all know that the person who's doing it the 10th time needs to get practice, right? Everybody has their first time. You just don't want to be the first or the 10th. Because if something goes wrong, you're going to say, see, you didn't know what you were doing. But if the 1,000th person is doing your surgery, but at the same time, the flip side is the newest person is going to be up to date on the most current innovations in the field. They're the sharpest. They've got the new technique, the new devices, the new understanding. And that's what you give up when you get experience. It's dynamic. It's accepting complexity. It's asking questions. It's understanding. It's getting the nuance. But the more you do, the better you get at it, right? And so we're fortunate we get to do a lot because of the people we've attracted and the others who have come, that we keep getting it. We made mistakes and you learn from that and you know to check that. So it's a bigger answer, but it's accept complexity and it's challenging. That's why most don't do it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.